Yeah, that's been rotting in the windowsill, and it still tastes pretty good to me. Um, I got that at the Korean market because it's the season right now. Like it was like 100 degrees Fahrenheit here, and that's when the ginseng is in the Korean markets because everyone makes the chicken ginseng soup.
It's cool.
But when I was a kid, this is what I did. Like for 10 years of my childhood, I worked in ginseng fields.
Welcome everyone to the Philippine International Comics Festival 2022. I am Duy Tano of the Comics Cube, and I am with the one and only Craig Thompson, Eisner Award winner, Harvey Award winner, Grammy nominee. How are you, Craig?
Good. How are you doing? Good to see you again.
It's good to see you again too. I have interviewed you before. It is on my archives in my channel, The Comics Cube. I will ask you, as I ask everyone at some point, why do you love comics? What is it that you love about the medium?
I think they just imprinted on me at the right age. I was a kid growing up. I've said this before, so I feel bad rehashing stuff I've probably said before in interviews, but I kind of grew up in this religious household where all the media was censored. So all the TV and movies and the music were strictly monitored to, meet Christian standards. So comics were just one of those mediums that flew below the parental radar. They were just kids stuff. So I think it's actually the medium where I was able to access the most personal and edgy content. And so that was a big part of the imprinting process. And it was a good era in like American comics, the 1980s, the kind of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles black and white boom, where there was just this flood of independent creators, and that's what got me excited for comics. So I think it just stems back to that, just coming from like this pre-internet age, having like this medium that felt very accessible, where like one person can write and draw and do it all. And
Were you exposed to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles before they got big?
yeah, my brother and I used to order our comics through the mail because there wasn't any comic shop where we lived. We were in the middle of nowhere. Of course, this is before the internet. You didn't order things online. So we would order from New England Comics in near, I think it was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And they would put out these monthly catalogs, sort of like the Diamond Previews catalogs, but all like black and white indie material. And so we got like kind of keyed into all the cool indie stuff, like the Turtles, like the Tick, like Usagi Yojimbo, all that sort of stuff, via this kind of mail order.
I've always wanted to ask this out of somebody who was there at the time.
Sorry, the
What?
light is doing some crazy things here. The sun is starting to hit me in a weird way.
It's okay.
Is that
The
okay?
sun is coming up over there, so.
Okay.
But I've always wanted to ask this out of somebody who was there at the time. What was it like seeing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles explode?
Oh yeah, my brother and I hated the cartoon when it first came out because we were young, but we were loyalists to the like edgy black and white Eastman and Laird comic book version, and we saw this like polished, googly-eyed sort of like Saturday morning version, and we hated it at first. But we quickly got on board because we were Saturday morning freaks too. But it was an awkward transition because we liked the darker like comic book material.
Yeah, you'll like the Daredevil / Ronin mashup,
Totally.
right? Yeah. But the thing that's weird for me about that is like whenever I take a look at that, I'm like, there's no reason, there's no rhyme or reason, there's no scientific explanation why the turtles ever got that big, and yet it did. So what does that say to you as an independent creator?
Yeah, just do whatever you want to do then. Do your own thing because yeah, you cannot predict what is going to take off ever.
Is there a particular comic from the 80s that sparked you wanting to make comics?
Um, let's see. Oh boy, that's a great question because I think my first love was the comic strips. So it was Peanuts, Charlie Brown, Bloom County, and Calvin and Hobbes. Those three, and that's kind of where I got the desire to make comics. But then, yeah, Eastman and Laird were a big influence, and Ben Edlund, The Tick, which also became a bit of a TV movie sort of thing too later on. But those were the big ones. Usagi Yojimbo, I mentioned, Stan Sakai. I was like with that from the beginning, Fantagraphics era.
How did you feel when Usagi Yojimbo showed up in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon?
Also did not like that either. I thought that totally diluted the character. And
I asked this out of everyone who names both Peanuts and Calvin and Hobbes. I do have to ask. I do want to know your opinion because I want to know where you stand as a fan. Which one is better?
ooh, I mean, I feel more emotional. Oh boy, that's a tough one. I was gonna say I feel more emotional attachment to Calvin and Hobbes, but Peanuts was my first love. I mean, that was where I learned to draw, is like copying Snoopy and Peanuts, or Snoopy and Charlie Brown. So, and for the longest time when I was a kid, all my characters were bald headed like Charlie Brown. It took me a long time to figure out how to draw hair because that was my intro.
Wait, does that
So
explain why your go-to character is a turtle?
uh, as in like the turtles, or
The turtles and he's bald?
oh yeah, you're right. You're right. Well, now I kind of look the same too. So uh, no, the Chunky Rice really came from my like love of like cutesy like Sanrio type characters, like a kind of semi-ironic love of those cutesy cartoons. So
Can you talk to me about wait, so you haven't said which one is better. You said what they both mean to you.
yeah, it's really
No.
hard to make. I mean, and they're different eras for me. You know, like I think probably Calvin and Hobbes is what really pushed me to be a cartoonist. And Bill Watterson's brush line and stuff, that's really what I aspire to. I think you can see some of that in Blankets more than my other work,
I can,
like
yeah.
trying to ape the kind of Bill Watterson brush line, but they're pretty equal. Those are the two big ones.
Does it did it make a difference for you whenever Bill Watterson would change his style for a particular strip? Like make it more realistic
I was
or
pretty
the
impressed, I think. Yeah, I think that did make a difference actually, because I also had my Marvel Comics superhero phase. And so I had a lot of, I had a love of that sort of Marvel way chops, to be able to draw anything, and, giant dinosaurs and spaceships and fantasy. And so the fact that he could expand his visual vocabulary like that was inspirational.
and did it inspire you as an artist at the time to also explore different types of styles, different tools maybe?
Well, when I was in high school, I was mostly interested in animation. So that was what I wanted to get into. That's why I was trying to study on my own. I was not really a tool centered person. It wasn't until like my early 20s when I was in community college and I started doing a newspaper strip for the college newspaper, that then I went out and was like, okay, what am I supposed to use? I'm supposed to use a sable brush. I'm supposed to use, I don't think I was using sable brushes then. I was too poor, but I was using a brush and an ink. And that was from probably very much influenced by Bill Watterson. I
Were
never went for the nib.
you never went for the nib? Yeah.
I keep trying to learn the nib and I never can. Someone told me recently it's because I work on rough paper. I work on vellum paper and you can't use nibs on that paper.
Does
You
it
need,
just spread?
yeah, it just kind of, yeah, the paper rips apart. It's a mess. And they're like, you got to
Oh,
use smooth paper. You got to use plate surface. And then I'm like, oh, okay, well, down the road, I'll give the nib another try.
but that would remove the texture of your usual work though, if you used smoother
It,
paper.
it would, yeah. But I mean, at this point, my work has a lot of dry brush effects, but it's not necessarily it's my style in spite of myself, like it's because I'm using that vellum finish and, my ink dries out too quickly and I don't have a choice but to do dry brush.
When you say it's your style in spite of yourself, is that something to do with maybe at that point, aside from the tools that you're using, but also maybe muscle memory? Like you ink a certain way, you pencil a certain way.
Probably, yeah. But I got to switch that up with whatever I do next. I need a new style. I need to switch it up.
Okay. So you mentioned Calvin and Hobbes as an early influence, Eastman and Laird, of course. How did you break into comics? Like, what was your first published work?
My first published work, well, I broke into comics via Dark Horse. And I think you and I talked about them the last time we talked a couple of years ago. That was my last real job. So I was doing a lot of work as a graphic designer. I worked at a newspaper and at an advertising agency. And then I got a job at Dark Horse out here in Oregon. and I was a graphic designer. So just doing like, designing the logos, the title logos, and advertisements, lunch boxes, toys. And I think I told you at the time when we last interviewed that it was my best and worst job ever. The best because I was working in comics and I was stoked to be in comics, and the worst because I was not making comics. I was
Yeah.
just kind of on the periphery. And they had like in my contract at the time, the people who worked at Dark Horse, whether they were editors or designers or whatever, they weren't allowed to contribute creative material, which I think has long since changed, because over the years you'll see that like editors write story arcs for different things and whatnot. But at that time, you could not be a graphic designer and contribute. And I got in
So
trouble.
weird.
I got in trouble actually because I was working on this humor anthology, Scatterbrain, and I kind of sneak in little illustrations that I would do because it fit into the graphic design. Like, oh, I need this design element. I'll just draw something here at my desk and scan it in and use it as part of the design. And my bosses caught me and they're like, no, you're not supposed to be drawing at work. You're supposed to be using vector points in Illustrator, So, but around that time, I got really bad tendonitis actually because I was working all day at the computer, still on a mouse. That was the old days of a mouse. And then I would work all night and every weekend on my comics. I was working on Goodbye Chunky Rice at the time. So I eventually developed this crippling tendonitis. I couldn't hold a pen or a computer mouse anymore. I had to quit the job and then take like a couple of months to recover my health. And during that time, after I recovered my health, Phil Amara and Scott Alley, who were editors at Dark Horse, contacted me. They're like, "Oh, can you do a couple pages for Scatterbrain now that you're not an employee anymore?" Because I left that job. And so I did a couple pages, and that really was my foot in the door. So I owe everything to Dark Horse. I think in our last interview, I might have said something disparaging about Dark Horse, which I say the
I
stupidest
don't
thing.
I don't think so. I was listening to it yesterday and I'm
Okay,
like, I
good.
don't think you said anything.
One of my friends said like, "Oh, you kind of threw Dark Horse under the bus or there," and I was like, "Really? Oh, I didn't mean to." And like when I say it was my worst job, I just mean exactly that. Like I really wanted to make comics, and it was frustrating to be around them all day long and not be able to actually make the comics. I was just designing lunch boxes.
I mean, it only sounds bad if you take it as a soundbite,
Okay, yeah, well,
right?
that's what people do, though, right?
Listen to context, people. It's important. All
So
right.
I owe my career to Dark Horse in a lot of ways because I got 2 pages published in this humor anthology, and then that kind of was a springboard to other things. Chris Duffy, who was the editor at Nickelodeon magazine in the 1990s and 2000s, contacted me, and I started doing comics for them. That was like my first like decently paying freelance gig. And really, this was a special era at Nickelodeon. They were like kind of creating work for all the indie cartoonists, everyone from Kim Deitch, like, like kind of this master indie cartoonist, to the young upstarts like Steve Weissman and myself and Sam Henderson. And, you know,
Yeah. I feel like that's a lost opportunity for me because I saw Nickelodeon magazine, but of course at the time I was too old to be getting it. And now I
yeah,
kind of wish that I had bought those. That and Disney Adventures, because I think like Steven Butler was maybe doing some things in it. Like,
yeah.
ah man, if I'd only known. Anyway, you are of course known for, would you say 3 books or 4 books at this point?
I want to hear what you say.
Okay. I think you are known mostly for a couple of books, Blankets and Habibi.
Yes.
And I discovered your work with Goodbye Chunky Rice. And of course, right now you're working on Ginseng Roots. You've also of course done Carne de Voyage. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which is a travel log, and not actually a graphic narrative. And also you have done Space Dumplings, as well as some other things like there's a mini comic that you did with James Kachalka.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, but I think mainly you're known for those three, and now Ginseng Roots, which you are currently serializing. In all of those, how does an idea get developed?
Oh boy. I mean, it's completely different with every project. Um, Blankets is probably my biggest book as far as its reputation, and I think that came about from a number of things. One of them was I had a bad contract. Actually, I was locked into a 3-book contract with Top Shelf, um, which felt really frustrating at that age. I was really young, and it was 3 books. Like the total advance payment for those 3 books was $1,000 to do 3 books.
Wait, what? Really?
$1,000, yeah, to do 3 books for them.
Okay.
Yeah, I was pressured into that contract at a young age. I think I was 21. I was resistant from the beginning. I think another artist, if they felt trapped in a contract like that, they would be like, oh, I'm going to do some throwaway, easy thing to get out of this contract. Like, oh, here's a easy book for you guys. Here's a 20-page book or something. I went the opposite route. I'm like, oh, if I have this contract, I can do whatever I want because, like I already have the contract, so I have like full creative control. And if they don't want it, they can release me from the contract, I guess. But for me, a lot of the novelty was like, I just want to make a really big book where almost nothing happens. It was sort of an anti what I thought comic books were at that time. It was an anti-comic book because it was still the era of like serialized comics and superheroes and fantasy. And I'm just like, oh, I'm just going to do a 500-page book that's very mundane and very simple and intimate. And to me, it was the anti-comic book comic book.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot. I mean, we talked about this last time. There were a lot of graphic novels back then that were also autobio, but yours feels very different, mainly because yours doesn't feel like it hates life.
Oh, thank you. And there weren't a lot of graphic novels actually at the time. Graphic novels were pretty new. So,
Oh,
like,
you mean original graphic novels?
yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess in collections. I mean, I Never Liked You, the Chester Brown book. That was a huge inspiration for me. And I think you can see a lot of correlation between the two. But that is a darker book, like that's sort of about his mom suffering schizophrenia and dying when he was still in high school and his inability to access his own emotions. It's really about being cut off from your own emotions. That book is. So I think I did want to do something warmer. And I was a big fan of like Dan Klaus, 8 Ball, and Chris Ware, everything they did. But both those books had a certain dark nihilism to them. It seemed to me at that age. So yeah, I did want to do something that was a little more warm.
Oh yeah, and they were serialized first before they got collected.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it did so with something like Blankets, then you just did whatever you want. So was there any pushback from the publisher for telling such a personal story?
No, so I just threw Top Shelf under the bus, but then they also ended up being actually we had ups and downs, but they were supportive of it as I was working on it because I would work on it and send them the chapters as I finished them, and they were just like full steam ahead. They loved it, so they're just like, keep doing this, keep making it. So they weren't shutting me down at all. They gave me a lot of freedom there. At the very end, we almost had a falling out though, because they ran out of money as a company and they were going bankrupt. And so I finished the book. It took me 3 or 4 years, which seemed forever at the time. Now at the pace I'm working now, that seems pretty fast. But it took me 3 or 4 years when I was in my 20s to finish that book. And then they're like, oh, we don't have the money to publish this. It can't come out. And then I got really scared. I'm like, oh no, I'm locked into this contract. Will this ever see print? What do I do? How do I need to seek legal advice to get out of it? I thought it would be a casualty of their own bankruptcy.
So how did they end up publishing it?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, I always say, yeah, I think what happened is they got a loan from Diamond. I think Diamond, which was the main and still the main distributor of comics in the US, gave them help pay for the first print run to get a larger cut on their distribution side. So I think Blankets was more paid for by Diamond.
And this is interesting because I know Blankets is a bestseller, really put your name on the map, and it sold a lot of copies. I bought 3 at the time. Because I was in college and I gave it to everyone I knew who went through a breakup. So, so did Blankets end up saving Top Shelf?
I think it probably did actually. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'd have to talk with Brett and see if that's how it worked. I mean, it's hard to be a small publisher. I know because I'm working with a small publisher. Again, I'm working with Uncivilized in Minneapolis. And yeah, I mean, it was like every book seemed to make or break them. You know, they would be completely going under. They'd put everything they had into, say, like Alan Moore's Lost Girls with Melinda Gebbie. And that they would sacrifice everything. They'd like put a mortgage, you know, whatever, refinance their homes and stuff so that they could pay for the print run on those books. And then they'd lose all the money at first. And then eventually a book like Lost Girls, I think, does pay itself off in time. So it's really hard to track, you know. Yeah, I don't know. You know what probably saved them actually is they sold the company to IDW a few years ago. And I think that's probably what is the reason that Top Shelf is still around.
Okay. Well, no,
Because all the other great indie publishers, if they weren't Fantagraphics or Drawn and Quarterly, all those other publishers eventually went under. It's just really hard for them to keep going.
you know what makes Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly different? Just is it just more
Yeah, I
business
do.
savvy
I
people?
think I
Yeah.
do know actually.
Yeah.
Well, Drawn and Quarterly gets some supplement, like they get some funding from the Canadian government because there's a lot of funding for the arts there. So you couldn't
Mm.
have Drawn and Quarterly in America basically because we don't fund the arts like that. So I think that's how they survive. And then
He says
Fantagraphics,
objectively and matter of factly.
I mean, I think it's
Yeah.
true. I think if they didn't have that government money, I think because they publish cool art stuff that
Yeah.
can't be making them much money, you know.
Yeah.
And they have such amazing production values and all that. Fantagraphics, I think, I mean, people joked for a while it was like they were doing like erotic porn comics. They had their Eros line or whatever. And I don't know if it's real or a joke, but I think that's what was floating them through some really difficult decades. They had this smut that they were publishing on the side so that
Oh.
they could do Love and Rockets and Dan Klaus over here, but they were publishing like you know, Cherry or Omaha the Cat Dancer and these sort of porn comics on the side.
I believe it.
Yeah, and then I think they also have had some, you know, like you mentioned Peanuts. I think those Charlie Brown Peanuts collections, I think having that license has helped them a lot.
Okay.
I think what I'm learning is that every publisher has like their whatever J.K. Rowling or whatever. They have their one thing that kind of supports 90% of everything else they publish.
Yeah, I believe it. Because if I look at um a publisher like Top Cow now and I see that Sunstone is their biggest seller, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I believe that it's a 90% thing that supports everything else.
Yeah, Image, it's Walking Dead or whatever it is now, Saga, you know, but it's always like this one thing that floats everything else.
Yeah. In DC, it's called Batman.
Definitely.
uh,
Wasn't Batman like one of the least selling books when Frank Miller did Dark Knight too?
I think so. Yeah.
Before he did Dark Knight, yeah.
I think that was it, and I think it was also dying before Adam West showed up, and then
Okay.
it built up again, and then it died again a little bit. So that was Blankets. What about the rest? Well, like, what about how did you pitch something like Goodbye Chunky Rice, a story about a turtle saying goodbye to a mouse?
I was already working on a mini comic version of that. And when I moved to Portland, Oregon, I was like 21 years old and I was making mini comics. And all the people that I kind of tracked down in town were people I knew through the mini comic community. Do I need to define what mini comics are?
Make little comics, right?
Yeah, yeah. And
You
handmade.
probably do for the audience.
Yeah, yeah. It was just like a 1990s, like an 80s thing, like zines and mini comics. So like homemade. I think, I mean, people still make mini comics,
Yeah.
but back then that's the only medium we had because there wasn't the internet and there wasn't, you know, a lot of indie publishers. There wasn't graphic novels. So John Porcellino being kind of the granddaddy of mini comics in the US with King Cat, you know, that's been probably the longest running mini comic, the most successful, the one that everybody universally loves. And he also ran a distribution company called Spit and a Half. So he kind of like is also responsible, like Dark Horse, for my career because he picked up my mini comics and started distributing them at least around the U.S. And there were a lot of people within that network, people like Tom Hart, who went on to do like Hutch Owen and stuff like that, and Jennifer Daydreamer, Megan Kelso with Girl Hero, but all these cool like 90s indie comics were being distributed by John Porcellino. So anyway, the long story is I get to Portland. I meet a guy through the mini comics scene named Brett Warnock, who's a bartender at an Italian restaurant. And he's doing like this like real homespun indie publishing thing out of his basement called Primal Groove Press. And they publish an anthology called Top Shelf. So that's the origins of Top Shelf. It was just one guy in his basement, bartender by trade, and then his hobby publisher. And he saw the mini comics I was working on, and among them was this Goodbye Chunky Rice. And he saw a lot of my comics, and he's like, I don't like this personal stuff you do. He's like, it's overly personal. That's just for like a very limited audience for your friends. But I like this little turtle guy. If you did a whole book of this, I would publish it. So that was a prompt. So that I'm like, oh, somebody likes something I'm doing. I'm going to sit down and flesh out a whole story. But I never really had a plot or anything. It was sort of like, most of it was written kind of improvisationally. So this is before my professional, life in comics.
You never typed it out or anything?
No. This is like 1997.
You went straight to layouts.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. Did you have a page count in mind, or did it end when it ended?
Well, there was a certain juncture. So then Brett teamed up like 6 months later or so, after we had a handshake over the book. He teamed up with two other guys, Chris Staros and Chris Orr, and then they had a real company. That's when Top Shelf, the company, began. Yeah. And that's when I signed that 3-book contract. They really were like, if we're going to publish you, you got to do a 3-book contract. We don't want you leaving us after we publish one of your books. And at that time, they saw what I was working on, and Chris Staros was like, well, this is just kind of a meandering story. What's the beginning and what's the end? So I sat down, I think I had a week, and I sat down and I thumbnailed a beginning and end for what at that point was really just meandering. But if you know the book, it's not like a hardcore beginning or end. It is kind of
it's meditative.
Yeah, it's like a poem. It's like a song. I wasn't going for a traditional plot.
Yeah, I think that's something. So one of the questions that I have here is there any advice you would give to aspiring creators? And that is something that I want to touch on, because I think a lot of people, when they start, they do have a traditional 3-act structure in mind, even when they want to do other things. So like if they want to do something more poetic, more in the moment, the feedback that they would get is like, oh, where's the plot? What's the story? Right? Like, how would you respond?
I mean,
to that?
I was lucky in that era because comics was not as competitive or professional. It was truly an indie scene then. So you could get away with that, and you can't now. So I feel bad for younger cartoonists now. You can't get your foot in the door as easily, other than the fact that you have the internet and you can do your own, like, Patreons and blog or whatever. You can do Instagram and Patreons and Kickstarters and all that stuff. And none of those resources existed when I was younger. But as far as just like being able to have a real loosey-goosey sort of handshake agreement and get something randomly published, that doesn't really exist anymore. And now I feel like publishers really they want to see that you can draw the entire book. If you haven't published a book, they want to see a book from beginning to end that you've done on your own dime, and then they'll consider publishing it.
You also mentioned earlier having a network that would boost you, that would signal boost you. Like, how important is that? Because I feel like, again, I feel like a lot of the younger artists that I speak to tend to be like, I'm going to focus on the work will speak for itself. Content is the king.
Yeah, like back then, like in the 90s, 1990s, of going to comic shows, the scene for indie guys and girls was so small. It was just like there was maybe a dozen people at every show that you could seek out, and you instantly became friends. You didn't have to like each other's work. It was just that we were in the same team, the same tribe. We're making indie comics. We're not doing superheroes. We're not doing what's mainstream. So it was easy to network then too. So now again, it's much more competitive now. Now people go to college, or graduate school for comics. Back then you couldn't get into a school. I mean, there were no comics programs in any college. I think there was like
It's the Joe
SVA,
Kubert school.
Joe Kubert, and SVA in New York. Those are the two schools in America that had comics classes. Um, and then very slowly, I remember the Savannah College of Art and Design had just started as a school. They weren't accredited yet. They had like 2-year degrees, and they were doing comics programs, and that was cutting edge. People were like, whoa, who's this weird new college? And now I think they're kind of one of the main ones. But yeah, there weren't comics programs. I went to art school briefly, but there weren't other people doing comics. That was not a thing. None of the professors supported what I was doing. They're like, why? What is this? Don't do this. Don't draw. I got rejected from my first art school portfolio review because I had a very cartoony style. And they're like, yeah, this won't fly. We don't want to see any cartoony stuff at all.
Okay.
So I didn't answer your question though. Sorry.
Well, so given that though,
Yeah.
when you're talking to a cartoonist who's on the up and up, right? And they ask you for feedback, what type of feedback do you give to make sure that you don't come off exactly as that type of authority figure saying like, oh, you're drawing things wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I got discouraged when I was going to meet my heroes at the Comic Cons with my mini comics and giving them a copy of my mini comic. A lot of times my heroes would just kind of toss it aside in disgust, or they'd be like, oh no, you can keep that, I don't want that. So my ego was bruised a lot in those early days because I wasn't getting support from those creators. But now I've been on the other end of the thing. Is when you're at a comics show, you don't really have time to give people any real feedback or anything. So I find that the best thing to do is just be gracious, and say something nice about what people give you, and then keep the line moving, But for me, I mean, the only time I've been able to really give feedback to people is I've done a few teaching things or workshop things, and that's when you can give more careful attention to a person.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a hard thing, like it takes a real skill to like be able to I'm really impressed by people like Steve Bissett, who teaches at the cartooning school, James Sturm School out in Vermont, or here in town there's I'm spacing on names. Anyway, yeah, some cartoonists are really good at being like generous with their time, giving very not holding any punches, but being very constructive in their criticism.
Yeah, I mean, how hard is it for you? I mean, not how hard, but like, what is the challenge if maybe somebody asks you for feedback and that person doesn't draw it all in the way that you do? Does that make a difference? Like, if somebody drew like Steve Bissett and asked you for advice, like
that never happens though. Usually I mean, there's like a delicate line between like lazy drawing and virtuosic drawing. Like I wish I could draw like Sempe or Shel Silverstein, these kind of old school cartoonists that, like Jules Pfeiffer, for instance. They could just looks like they are dashing off the drawings. They're very casually, quickly drawn, but they're kind of masterful drawings, And I think a lot of cartoonists I meet just maybe have kind of a lazy drawing style. It's just a subtle line, though. It's hard to describe because I feel like my work is overwrought and over detailed. I get angry at my own work, like, oh, that looks like I worked on it too hard,
I don't think your work looks over detailed.
I'm
Until we
not
get
fishing for
to
compliments, but I mean, I'm aware that like blankets, I feel like I was working really quickly. I was doing 2 pages a day.
Yeah.
It wasn't my full-time job. I had to do other work. I was an illustrator by trade. So like, and it was being an illustrator was a great gig because it meant like I only had to work about part-time, so 20 hours a week doing illustration, and the rest of the week was doing my personal work. But I was working quickly and I was young and I was, keeping it loose and penciling really light. So I look at that work and I think like, oh, it has a nice, loose, free gestural quality that I've kind of lost the further I've got down the line. It's like each book I do ends up being more detailed than the last.
Is
I
Carne
wish
de,
I could strip away some of that detail.
is Carne de Voyage the third book in that 3-book contract?
It is, yeah.
How did you swing that? Because I don't think I've seen a travel log from a cartoonist before or since.
Well, I was inspired by the French cartoonists like John Sfar and Louis Trondheim and a few other the L'Association cartoonists. They were doing these, what were they called? I stole the format entirely from them. It's like a tradition in French comics to do travel logs, to
Yeah.
do sketchbook diaries. I stole the dimensions and everything from basically what they were doing.
The paper, the texture of the paper.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely the texture of the cover, which had this like uncoated stock. And so yeah, it hadn't been done at that point in the US. And I mean, the whole story, I think I've explained it before. I was going through a really hard time in Portland. I went through a bad breakup. I decided to go to Europe to kind of sort out my life. I had a couple friends in France I was going to stay with. When my French publisher learned I was going to be in Europe, they like organized this whole French book tour for me. And then my Spanish, my Italian, all my publishers suddenly it was turning into a book tour. And I was like, oh, this is too much. I still got to have some time for myself. So that's when I figured out spending 3 weeks in Morocco, which kind of planted some of the seeds of Habibi. And then as I was leaving, I was like, I'm going to be in Europe for 3.5 months straight. I've never taken a vacation in my life. I'll go crazy if I'm not doing something productive with my time. And that's when I decided like, oh, I'm going to keep a diary, a comics diary. And I talked to Top Shelf before I left, like, hey, is this something maybe we would publish down the road if I do this? And they're like, no, let's publish it now. So it was solicited in Diamond before I left for the trip. I had to do a cover for the book. And then I had that added pressure, but also motivation, of like, okay, now I actually have to produce something. And I had a page count. They're like, if we want it to be $15, it can't be any more than 224 pages. So I'm like, I got to fill up 224 pages of a sketchbook and then stop.
But that means you could go over, right? You
I
could
couldn't go over.
I mean, you could
or
and then remove it.
It could go over. I could remove it, or the cover price would go up $5 if I went over that amount. And I didn't want that either. I'm like, well, I can't be an expensive book. It's got to be. I wish it was a $10 book, So
that is interesting. Why do you think they published something so unique?
Yeah, I mean, again, good on them to take to try something new. I think Blankets was doing well. That came out a year after Blankets debut, so I think they were capitalizing on that too. Like, oh, you've got some heat around you right now. Better to have something.
I was gonna ask if you thought they would have done it if you weren't at the time Craig Blankets Thompson.
Probably not. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess in a couple ways I've lucked out. I lucked out with my first book because I was starting with a new publisher who had never published anything, and I had never published anything. We were both brand new and naive, and it was not a competitive market. And then,
how did you pitch Habibi?
Habibi is the only book I've pitched, actually.
Yeah.
Of all my books, it's the only one I pitched. That was 2004. And I was having trouble getting paid at that time. My book was doing well, Blankets was doing well, but I wasn't getting paid. So then Joe Sacco, the great comics journalist, who lives here in Portland, and who I think of as the greatest cartoonist in all of North America.
Really?
He became a friend and a mentor to me. And he said the best decision he made in his career was getting an agent. And this was 2004. And I ended up getting an agent, and it was kind of all motivated by the agent of like, okay, you're in the New York book publishing world now. Let's pitch your next project. Let's also strike while the iron is hot. Everybody's talking about Blankets. Let's do this while people are talking about Blankets. So even though all I had was an idea, some concept sketches, that's what I had to go on to pitch. And then we went to all the major like New York publishing houses at the time. Scholastic was just starting their graphics line. We met with DC. We met with everyone, but it was Pantheon was the clear winner. They were like the publisher I wanted to work with the most. But anyway, yeah. So that pitch was really like maybe 9 pages of artwork and then a 1-page outline. That's all it was.
A 1-page outline for a 500-page book.
It's almost 700 pages. It's 666 pages.
And I saw that you intended it to be 250.
Yeah, I did. Yep. Yeah. Every book though, I think it'll be shorter. So yeah, I thought like, oh, it'll be about 250 and I'll have it done within 3 years. And that book took me from the time I pitched in 2004, it didn't come out until 2011. So 7 years.
Yeah, I remember in 2008 hearing that it'll be out soon.
Yeah.
And then it didn't come out till 2011. I was like, what
Yeah,
happened? And then I saw the book and I was like, oh, that's what happened.
Yeah. People have given me so much flack about that too. Like, can't believe you spent 8 years on something, but that said, you don't see a lot of similar books. I mean, anytime you see a Habibi-esque book, it also took like that long, you know. Clyde Fans from Seth, that took 20 years. He just finished that 20 years. I don't know how long Jason Lutz Berlin took, but Fun Home took Alison Bechdel 10 years. So it's like, at a certain point, once you're doing long format graphic novels, it's like you're going to lose a decade of your life.
What about Monster by Barry Windsor Smith, which took him 40 years?
Oh, wow. I haven't seen that book yet either. Is that out now?
It's out. It just won an Eisner. I haven't read it. I'm like, 40 years? I don't know if I can, like, I feel like I would feel bad knowing I'm reading somebody's 40-year work. I don't know.
Yeah, it's literally their lifeblood.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of contrast in the way my cartoonist friends talk about their careers and lives. You know, I'm friends with Gabriel Ba and Fabio Moon in Brazil. And they're like kind of saying like, okay, we've got these 2 more graphic novels before we die.
Really?
Yeah, and those
Those
guys
two
really
are so productive.
They're productive, they're prolific, but I think they're thinking of their day tripper, very like personal, you know, graphic novel work, what it's going to demand out of them and how much time they have to do it. They're like, we've got a couple more. But then I talk to other people who are like, oh, I've got these 12 graphic novels that I'm going to do before I die. And it's just different approaches. You know, some people see a graphic novel as a 1-year project, and other people are like, oh, it's going to be a decade probably to do this, you know?
Yeah. It's like, I don't remember who's the guy who composed Hallelujah.
Leonard Cohen?
Leonard Cohen. I think it took him like years to write that one song. And then meanwhile, you see somebody like Bob Dylan who like knocks out a song in like 5 days or something.
Yeah.
It's not a statement on one or the other. It's just that it's different for different people in any medium, in any discipline.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'm more the Leonard Cohen style. So
that's okay.
There's enough crap in the world. I don't need to produce that. You know, I don't need to cut down that many trees. So
you did mention also before in another interview that you do feel bad about contributing to image pollution.
Yeah.
Do you still feel that way now with the internet, with all sorts of stuff just being out for free?
Yeah, I do. I'm losing motivation as a creator because I don't quite see the point of producing more things. You know, it seems like I feel like the human species is already shifted into a new dynamic as primarily consumer. Well, obviously, right? We're as a species, we're primarily consumers. Why make more things? I don't know. I get kind of existentialist dread about it, you know. Every day I have to go through that process of like, why make something more, you know?
So every day, what is the answer that you tell yourself?
I don't know.
Or is it different every day?
I would rather make something than consume something. So maybe that's it, you know?
Does it also make a difference that, you know, several of your books have literally changed people's lives, like have made such an impact in people's lives?
Yeah, I forget. Thanks for the reminder. That's the cool thing about being on book tour is that you hear those stories, you know, and you have the contact with the readers, and that feels like that makes a difference. That's where it feels worth it. But you know, I haven't traveled now for, you know, 3 years, and yeah, so like I feel a lot of detachment from the readers, unfortunately. Maybe if I was a little more active on social media or something, I would feel a little more connected to the readers. But then I don't know where you balance your time between making things and also dealing with all of that. So
Yeah, I find writers are on social media more than artists, and it's
yeah,
probably because they can stay at the keyboard.
and no offense, it takes less time to write something. Drawing comics is a really tedious, slow task, you know.
Yeah.
I wrote like Space Dumplings, that book I wrote in under 3 months. Well, I guess I drew Carne de Voyage in under 3 months. You know, I did that in 2.5 months. But Space Dumplings, it took me 3 years to write, or 3 months to write it, and then 3 years to draw it. You know, so it's such a drastic difference in those process. I should just write comics. That's where the money is at. You know, that's
But
the
they,
more efficient use of your time.
but then you'd have to write a lot of comics, wouldn't you?
Probably. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, if I got half of the income from a book that I wrote in 3 months, you definitely make more money writing.
Ginseng Roots is published by Uncivilized Books. The last time we talked, I believe you were on issue 4. How's that going right now?
I'm working on issue 11 right now, and then there's one more issue after that. So I have got some of them here actually, just really quick. You know, like they're all old school pamphlet comic books.
Yep.
And
How's that feel going back to those roots?
you know, I never got to do a comic book, you know, but it's not the marketable, lucrative version of comics anymore. Everything's graphic novels. So I kind of did it at the wrong time, but I'm happy I've had a chance to do pamphlets basically.
I feel like your whole career has been defined by doing the thing that people expect least.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything I've started on at the time I did it was not the cool thing to do, you know, or it was just not a normal thing to do, but I wanted to do it anyway. So
That's how
with
you.
the exception of Space Dumplings, I feel like Space Dumplings is a little bit more of a mainstream sort of project for me. But it also was not what people expected of me. They wanted me to keep on doing more serious work, and I did this kind of goofball kids sci-fi, you know, scatological comedy. But yes,
Ginseng Roots,
Ginseng
yeah.
Roots, I'm ready for this to be done, you know, and I've got another issue and a half, and the last issue is double sized, so I still got about 100 pages to draw. So I'm on the finishing stretch, but there's still 100 pages.
And again, how did you approach Uncivilized Books with Ginseng Roots?
Well, Drawn and Quarterly was going to publish the graphic novel, and I talked with them early on, like, oh, I'd really love to serialize this. Can we do it as a comic book? Because Drawn and Quarterly, of course, did like Optic Nerve and not Black Hole, but you know, like Seth, Clyde Fans, stuff like that. And they said, no, we're done with serialization. Like Optic Nerve ended, Clyde Fans ended, Berlin ended. We're not going to do any more. That's just, you lose too much money on serialized comics. And so I asked them, well, what if I do it with another publisher, just the serialization? And I mentioned Uncivilized, I mentioned Floating World, which is a smaller company here in Portland. And D&Q was like, oh yeah, totally. They can only help the later graphic novel if you serialize first. So they just didn't want to be the ones to do it.
They didn't want to do the serialization.
They did not. And I talked to Fantagraphics about it too, and they had a similar attitude where they're like, they had a little nicer attitude actually. They're like, we will publish the serialization if you want, but we don't actually want to. We just want the graphic novel. But if you demand it, we'll do the comic book. And I'm like, oh, I want to find someone who's actually enthusiastic about doing this old school format.
For the people who aren't aware, how would you describe Ginseng Roots?
So it's a book about the Chinese medicinal herb ginseng. I think I could grab one from I have one sitting here actually. This one's a little dried out because he's been on the windowsill.
Yeah.
Do you know the flavor of ginseng?
Yeah.
Okay,
It's
good.
it's that's the thing. That's the thing that surprised me. I think I told you last time is that I didn't even realize it was in the US.
Yeah, that's been rotting in the windowsill and it still tastes pretty good to me. Um, I got that at the Korean market because it's the season right now. Like it was like 100 degrees Fahrenheit here, and that's when the ginseng is in the Korean markets because everyone makes the chicken ginseng soup.
It's cool.
But when I was a kid, this is what I did. Like for 10 years of my childhood, I worked in ginseng fields. My tiny town was like this rural kind of redneck community of 1,200 people. Happened to be the largest producer of American ginseng in the entire world in the 1980s,
Blows my
which
mind.
it's
Yeah.
crazy. Yeah. And when I was 10 years old, I started working 40 hours a week in the summer in the fields, just picking weeds with my mom.
I'm sure
And
that violated no child labor laws.
it doesn't actually. There aren't child labor laws in regards to agricultural work
Oh,
because in America, when they instituted like work unions, the 40-hour work week, and child labor laws, they did not touch the family farm because at that point, like 80% of Americans were farmers. And so they're like, oh, we're not going to stop 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds from driving tractors and working on the farm with their families. So there's
okay.
still no laws. So
To
now
this
if you go
day.
to like, yeah, if you go to like through California, it's like lots of kids, usually the kids of like Mexican immigrants and whatnot, working out in the fields, strawberry fields and all that. And that really seems like criminal child labor issues at that point. Because at
Yeah.
least in the 80s, nobody knew, they didn't know better. But um, I was stoked about it though, because I was getting paid $1 an hour. And that's the only reason I had comic books. My parents didn't buy us comics. They never bought us a single comic book. We had to earn our own money. So we were stoked 40 hours a week, $40 a week, 40 comics a week.
Is that also why maybe you were drawn to black and white stuff? Because it's probably cheaper?
No, it wasn't cheaper then.
No?
No,
Okay.
I liked indie stuff even at a young age, better than
Okay.
the mainstream.
Yeah, so Ginseng Roots, you alternate between the flashbacks to your youth and to what it is that you're going through now, right?
Yeah,
So
and I mean, I also talk a lot about ginseng itself because it's such a fascinating herb. It's really the beginning of the trade relationship between China and the U.S. before the U.S. was even a nation. Like way back in 1708, French Jesuit explorers were already like digging up American ginseng and sending it to China for money. And the very first ship that the U.S. sent to China was 1784. It was primarily ginseng, and they were using that money to pay for the American Revolution, pay their debts to France.
amazing.
So like our history as a nation is very much connected to this route, and
And no one ever talks about it.
certainly our relationship to China, and now more than ever, like trade wars and the way that globalization. I wanted to explore all those different themes.
And how it connects it to today.
Yeah.
All right. So my one of my last questions is this. With blankets, you had a very, very personal story. With Goodbye Chunky Rice, you had a personal story, but it was also wrapped up in some fantastical elements. With Habibi, it's very clear you did a lot of research. And with Ginseng Roots, it's looking like a mix of both personal and
Mhm.
a lot of research.
Yes.
Which of these two things is harder? Laying your personal vulnerabilities out like that, or doing all that research?
Again, they're both equally hard. Like boy, my gut would say that the research. Well, no, it's hard to say. The research is harder when it comes to drawing because I feel like blankets. I was very free. I wasn't using Google image search. I was drawing things from my memory and my imagination. That felt really free. Now I'm very meticulously, you know, the photos I've taken myself on my research trips, but I'm trying to get the details right. I'm like, I'm not making up this space. This is a very tangible, real space. The same with the dialogue. I'm working with dialogue from my voice memo recordings when I interviewed people. Then I like transcribe those interviews, and it's hard to find good lines sometimes. It's like people babble like I'm babbling now. It's like, well, you're a journalist, it's hard to find those nuggets of great lines, but I'm trying to be really true to the material and authentic. So that can be really demanding. Sometimes the amount of research, sometimes I read an entire book just to get one panel right, you know?
Oh, interesting. Because like
Yeah.
you were talking earlier about how in your work on blankets felt more free and definitely like less detailed than the works that you've done afterwards.
Yeah.
But isn't that just a byproduct of the fact that Habibi and Ginseng Roots are more research intensive?
Probably. You're probably right. So after this, I want to distance myself from the more, nonfiction research based material. I don't know. But it is kind of like what I like to read. I like documentaries, but I don't know if comics are the ideal medium for doing documentaries.
Well, I like them.
Oh,
So,
good.
I
I mean,
mean,
that said, I just
that is like, what do you think comics is the ideal medium for? Because
probably personal autobio stuff, actually. I think maybe it's better than any other medium for telling like awkward personal stories.
why do you think that is? Like, what does it have over, for example, the written word?
That you can see the handwriting of the author in the lines, so there's a real nakedness to the actual lines on paper. Otherwise, you're hiding behind typography. So you have this wall of separation, with the technology involved.
And
If prose novels were handwritten, they would be pretty difficult to read. They'd be illegible, but they'd probably be more personal and intimate,
it
in
would
the
be
way that comics are to me.
would read more like a diary.
Yeah,
I guess I can see that. Yeah.
yeah.
Because I mean, I think even superheroes, I don't think comics do them the best anymore. I think movies do them the best.
I think you're right. Yeah, video games and movies are
Video
better for
games and movies.
superheroes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Ginseng Roots, when can we expect the collection to come out?
It's going to be a while here. So I will finish the series like March of next year. And hopefully I'll finish the graphic novel by the end of next year, probably by fall of next year. But because of the New York publishing schedule, it's not going to come out until spring of 2025.
Wow.
So daunting. Yeah.
So you're gonna finish it 2 years in advance.
Yeah. So, and it used to be 1 year. It used to be when you would finish a book, there would be a 1 year turnaround before it was in print. But now with supply chain issues, of course, America, they've always printed in China and they can't do that anymore. And nothing is printed quickly anymore. So it's like, they said it's a minimum of 18 months, but because the American elections are happening in fall of 2024, they're like, we have to push into spring of 2025 because
Oh
of the
wow.
elections.
That seems
It's a,
unpleasant, Craig.
it's a long wait. Yeah, I'll have like 2 years to work on other things. By the time I'm like on book tour, I'll be sick of ginseng. That's what happens though, right? It's like,
By that time, you'll be doing a fiction piece that you don't have to do any research for.
yeah. I wanted to show my shirt, by the way. I have got my synagogue.
Oh, cool. Have you
It's
ever
my
had
favorite.
sinigang?
It's one of my favorites. It's one of my comfort foods.
It's wonderful, isn't it?
I love it, love it, love it. Tamarind broth with
Yeah,
pork. I like pork synagogue.
with pork. Yeah, it's either with pork or with beef for me, but like some people like it with fish too.
Yeah, I think I've had fish and I like that too, but pork is the go-to for me. Like
Same.
fatty pork belly.
I'm really glad. Is it who are the I'm just gonna ask, who are the Filipinos in your life?
I feel like I always have Filipinos in my life, but I was living in Los Angeles, not last time we talked, but during pandemic, I've lived in Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and Portland. And in Los Angeles, I was near a bunch of Filipino restaurants, so I had to get my like at least weekly fix of sinigang.
Ah, that's awesome. I can't believe there are Filipino restaurants now. Okay.
And
I'll
actually,
head over.
Minneapolis was not bad for Filipino food either. I had at least 3 options in a close vicinity.
Oh, cool. I didn't even
Yeah.
know that. Because when I lived there, it's just like people are like, "Where's the Philippines?" I'm like,
When did you live there? What was the year?
"Oh no, I lived in Pennsylvania from '02
Oh,
to
okay,
06, and then I lived in
okay,
DC for like from '06 to '07, and then I came
okay.
back here."
Well,
Uh,
West Coast is different, of course. Like LA has a big Filipino, population, as does like San Diego and Southern California in general. So
yeah, Yeah, it's just I was there and I was in LA in 2015, and I don't think I saw a Filipino restaurant. Not that I was looking, because like why would I? You know, like because I can come back to it. But
Yeah,
now that you've mentioned it, I'm just like, wow, there are Filipino restaurants now. That blows my mind. Okay,
the
yeah.
best. I wish I could. Now I'm craving some right now. Like I gotta find some. I don't have a good hookup in Portland though, but I have friends who are. They run a restaurant it's mostly Guam. What do you call Guam food? Uh, uh, but they're half Filipino and half from Guam, and so they do a lot of Filipino dishes there too.
Oh yeah, and sinigang is a staple.
Chamoran, it's Chamoran food, right? Is from Guam.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a huge Filipino population in Guam too. Like a lot
Okay.
of Filipinos work there. My last question is there any advice you would give that we haven't covered to an aspiring cartoonist, somebody who's just starting out?
Um, just draw all the time. You know, is it Dave Sim that said you got to draw 1,000 bad pages, basically? Someone like that said it, and it's pretty solid advice. Like you just have to, you certainly have to draw 100 bad pages, you know, and I know I have. Like when I'm working, one thing I always say is it takes like 3 days of drawing to get in kind of a flow. It takes 3 months of drawing, you know, to really be locked in, but it takes about it's about 3 months of drawing for the work to be good. And that's like drawing every day. So it's just like a lot of drawing, but you got to draw 100 or 1,000 bad pages to get to the good ones.
How about anything to prevent them from getting tendonitis?
Oh yeah. Oh, that actually, yeah. Didn't I think Alison Bechdel just released a new book about her whole like exercise regimen. I want to check out that book, but I do think like probably finding ways to like, yeah. I went swimming yesterday. It's still warm in Portland, and so like swimming, I was like, okay, this is helping undo all the damage of hunching over my desk all day. So finding those activities that balance out the being hunched over a desk. I'm definitely suffering a lot in old age. I'm 47 now, you know, and so like I need to find ways to like keep my hands limber and stuff. They're kind of breaking down with age.
Oh,
Backs, you know. So yeah, do some exercise to balance out the grueling effect of cartooning, and do a bunch of just keep making pages. They're going to be bad at first. That's normal. That's how you learn everything. I also would say don't draw a 500-page book as your first book. You know, I've said this. Maybe I said it to you last time we talked. It's like do baby steps. Do a mini comic. Do a comic strip. Start with short things. You know, everybody does Instagram like comic strips now. That's a great format. You know, because it can be really casual, rather than putting all your eggs in one basket. Like you know, I had to, my third was it my third book? My second book was blankets, but still that was kind of a weird move to go that route. And but
it's
I
the
had already
biggest
done comic strips and stuff before that.
it's the biggest trap, right? It's like everybody wants to do Lord of the Rings like right off the bat.
Yeah, and your drawing style is going to evolve so much in the course of you're going to make so many mistakes and learn so many things. By the time you're finished, you're like, this is not even coherent or publishable. So don't start with the big project. You know, build up to it, do little things, but do a lot of stuff. Do that many pages, but different projects.
And you're probably the best person to ask to answer this question, but how how emotionally vulnerable should any creator be when creating something?
I mean, it sucks. I don't like being emotionally vulnerable, but it's what I want to read. And I think it's what readers respond to. So you have to be, you know, that's what readers are seeking in whatever medium it is, I think.
Yeah.
So it's good to be emotionally vulnerable. And also like, that's where you find the stories that are completely unique to you, but also universal is in those vulnerable spots.
Yeah, we all go through the same feelings. We just may not all be going through them in the same way.
Yeah, you said it better than me. That's great.
Thank you, Craig. This was great. This has been the Philippine International Comics Festival. Craig Thompson, everyone.
Wish I could be there. Thank you. Thanks for this time.